So I've been watching parts of the Joe Rogan Experience interview with Vice President J.D. Vance, and a lot of people are reacting to this, and I'm gonna just sit here and add to the noise a little bit because there's just when he is talking about basically he's defending the Ten Commandments being displayed in schools in Texas. And JD's argument is basically that, we're part of a big law giving tradition in Western civilization, and that this is one of the big texts, the Ten Commandments, that is like really important for understanding where we came from. And that like when he's sitting in a class, he's not offended by the idea that like he might look over and see, one of our founding documents basically on the wall. He really does put it not quite in those words, but very, very close to that. Like he's talking about the cultural and religious elements of, American civilization as we experience it now, having its roots there. And I just really, there's a lot of what I'm going to call Hammurabi erasure here, because first and foremost, the form of much of the Mosaic Law, which is preceded by the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments, they're really not laws. They're ways that you ideally would act. I mean, I'm going to probably miss a couple and get the order wrong, but basically, you start off with two that are about God himself. The first is basically, you shall have no other gods before me. And that's, this may be a little bit of a retrojection, but it's mostly interpreted as being God is the only God. He is the highest. You are to worship him. You are not to worship others above him. And the second kind of builds on that, and that's no graven images, which is typically about idolatry, not having, in Exodus when Moses goes onto the hill the first time, he comes back down, he sees that his people are worshiping a golden calf. And I don't remember all the details. Maybe I should have looked at this beforehand. But basically, he destroys it and he goes back up and he comes down with the Ten Commandments. I might be splicing together, a couple different stories, because this is one of those sort of founding mythologies that gets retold over and over and over again, retold a little bit differently in different contexts. So I'm not sure that I'm accurately reporting exactly what happens in Exodus. You'll have to read it for yourself. All I know is that this happens after they leave Egypt. But in any case, the main commandments after those two, no gods before God and no graven images, there's a bunch of stuff that's pretty unobjectionable. Oh, other than remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. I will tell you right now, Christians do not agree on what that means. Because there's the Jewish Sabbath, which I believe starts on like Friday night even. And so there's some churches that have it on Friday. There's some churches that reinterpret it to be like Saturday. And, most of us in Protestant America experience it as Sunday. And, it doesn't have to be that way, for one thing. It's worth keeping that in mind. It doesn't have to be that way. And I forgot to mention, when it comes to the second commandment about graven images, Vice President J.D. Vance is a born-again Catholic. Anybody who's familiar with the evangelical or Catholic traditions going to maybe get a little chuckle out of that one. But basically, he was raised as some kind of very likely evangelical Protestant from roughly a Southern Baptist tradition. And I'll just say, J.D. Vance is about 10 years older than me. The modern evangelical movement really started in about 1980 with Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority. It's really comes out of the Southern Baptist Convention. And the Southern Baptist Convention, maybe it's ain't here nor there, but Southern Baptists split with the Northern Baptist over slavery in like 1830, specifically the question of whether priests, or excuse me, they don't have priests, whether their clergy could have slaves. And so, the sins of the father may or may not be visited upon their children up to the 100th generation or whatever. That I'm not really qualified to speak on, but it's right there in the book, so do with that what you will. But coming back to the whole Ten Commandments, we got 1, 2, 3, no gods before God, graven images, remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. Man, I'm going to miss one. I should have brought up my notes, but in any case, the next ones, as I recall it at least, are a lot less objectionable. Don't murder. I feel like I don't have to explain that a whole lot. Murder is defined as wrongful killing. So, doesn't preclude you from somebody attacks you, you kill them in defending yourself, right? No adultery. Not sure adultery meant quite the same thing back then. But I think that, certainly sleeping with another man's wife is frowned upon. And, you know, adultery is one of the more common sins among high-profile, powerful men, but most notably Donald Trump, Pete Hegseth, and Ken Paxton. Those are the first three names that come to my mind. I know there's a bunch of Democrats. Bill Clinton comes to mind there. Eric Swalwell, I believe, was involved in something like that. Graham Plattner, for sure. Not one political party that has a monopoly on this here adultery. But I will say those three that I first came up with for the Democrats, none of them are actively in politics. Bill Clinton's really the only one that got away with it in any meaningful way. And yeah, the Republicans, they have themselves a born-again experience, and, the past is the past, I guess. Although I tend to believe that past is prologue, but losing myself here. So I was on, what was it? So I got don't lie. That's another one of the Ten Commandments. Do not bear false witness. Worth noting that J.D. Vance is awfully loose with the specific facts of where exactly these traditions. Now, it's only a lie if you know what the truth is, right? That's kind of how Donald Trump gets away with a lot of his lies, is that, there's genuine doubt over whether he's actually sort of lucid enough in how he approaches his interactions with observable reality to actually know what is, just based on looking at it. But generally speaking, people say don't lie and definitely don't bear false witness in court. That's actually in the legal code, right? As is murder. To some extent, adultery is, although it's more of like a civil thing than a criminal thing. But, law is the law to some extent. And what else we got? Do not covet. Now, I would say that, whether or not we view coveting someone else's things as a sin, Jesus says something about it being like adultery of the heart to covet another man's wife or something like that. I'm going to have to look it up. Adultery of the heart will probably bring you to a verse, and you can read it in whatever translation you like, see if I got that right. But in any case, that's sort of a moral judgment. Coveting obviously ends up being a root of a lot of later crimes. Like, if you covet someone's wife, you may go out of your way to seduce their wife, and, that's adultery, right? But yeah, we already had, listen to your parents, basically. Honor thy father and mother, if you like the King James Version, the only version good enough to grace a schoolroom in Texas. But that one, like, it's kind of just good advice most of the time. Obviously, there's abusive parents that don't have their children's best interests at heart. But I hope that's, uncommon. My personal experience is that parents make mistakes, but in general, kids are better off listening to their parents than not. So, and I guess my point here is I'm probably short a couple of commandments here. I don't think I mentioned stealing. But yeah, I mean, look, I think that 6 out of 10 commandments are just objectively good advice. 4 of them are theological claims. And really, the best way to understand the 10 Commandments is that the 10 Commandments is to the Mosaic law of the later portions of Exodus as the preamble is to the Constitution. We talk about, maybe the Declaration of Independence is a similar thing, where it's not legally binding. You're just sort of talking about what we believe, and talking about the stuff that we as a people are supposed to affirm. But actually, the laws come later, and I just the fact that JD Vance says 8 out of 10, I would say 6 out of 10 are really what I hope people would affirm. I honestly don't care whether people profess that they believe in God or not. I care that they follow Him. Okay? And the Bible, as a text, is not exactly clear about it, because there's a later part of this interview, I guess, this podcast, where JD Vance is talking about how he thinks, like I said, the whole thing here is about how he thinks the 10 Commandments, it's fair for them to be in schools. He's defending the fact that they, I don't know if it's required or are certainly allowed, and there's like rules about how the 10 Commandments, if they are in a classroom, are to be presented, and it has to be the King James Version. And Joe's like, man, what's up with that? And JD's like, well, it's all about the text history and tradition of the United States of America. Basically, sounded like the Federalist Society trying to explain religious doctrine out here. But there's a part where Joe pushes back, 2 different parts. One where he pushes back about, says like Muslim stuff, and then the other one where he remembers that it's called the Quran, and he's like, what if the Quran were to be a section of it put in a classroom? And J.D. Vance is like, well, as long as it's not anything crazy. And yeah, the first thing I thought of when I heard that was, yeah, because if you had the Quran, you might have some crazy stuff like a guy's daughter's getting him drunk and then having sex with him to continue his line, or very specific instructions about how you're to treat your female slaves versus your male slaves, and the slaves that are from your own people versus foreign war plunder slaves. And oh, sorry, my bad. That's actually the Old Testament. That's all in Exodus. So, like, I think sort of the nothing too crazy principle, obviously that's a reasonable principle. But craziness is a little bit in the eye of the beholder. And I'm not somebody who is, not that I'm in a position to not allow men like Mike Johnson or Ken Paxton or J.D. Vance or any of these people that want to legislate morality as they see it. I'm not someone who's really in a position to tell them no, but, I'm certainly not interested in being quiet while people who pervert the gospel are trying to twist it to make my nation into something that it was never intended by the founders to be. And I don't know. That's just how I see it.